the approaching great transformation. So that'll be our topic for tonight. So Joel Magnuson, Ph.D., is an economist, writer, speaker, and affiliated professor of economics at Portland State University. He has written 5 books, including The Approaching Great Transformation Toward a Livable Post-Carbon Economy, which forms the basis of this presentation, which I shouldn't have said that because that was in here, but anyway. Transforming our economic system into something new and better will require the development of educational programs aligned with this effort. Educational institutions need to develop new curricula and workshops that will provide tools and guidelines for people who seek to learn how to become citizens in their communities and to design, heal, manufacture, grow, repair, plan, rebuild, as well as to become the visionaries of their own generation. Please welcome Joel Magnuson. So Joel is going to do a little introduction, and then we'll kind of do a tag team. So.
Okay. So I actually wanted to make some wisecrack about how I'm running Donald Trump's 2024 campaign, and I didn't get the chance. So well, this book, The Approaching Great Transformation, the way it came about was that it was a follow-up to another book that I had published in 2008, Mindful Economics. In that book, what I did was, sort of lay out the institutional structure of the U.S. economy, looking at all the major institutions and how they developed and evolved over time, historically. What I was thinking at the time was that there's a lot of material out there where people are looking at environmental problems or social problems or justice issues, whatever. And, from a critical point of view, there's like 350 pages of things that are spelling out what the problems are. And then there's like 2 pages at the end saying what we can do about it, right? And so it's the way I was looking at it. That's the easy work, right? Picking out the problems and doing that kind of analysis. That's the easy work. The hard part is talking about where we're going to go in the future. What do we want to do? What's the vision? What's the paradigm of moving forward? And a lot of people are very hesitant to do that because. A friend of mine who's a Jungian psychologist, he said, "Joel, you're a fool." But in Jungian terms, the fool is actually a very good thing. It's the guy who's like whistling and walking off the edge of a cliff or something. But the idea of the fool is someone who's not really paying attention to the dangers and the pitfalls because he's got an idea and he wants to move forward with it. So I decided to be the fool and write this book about the approaching great transformation. Yeah.
Thanks, Joel. We're gonna talk about each chapter independently, and I'll start out with as part of the introduction. Or first, let me say the thing I really liked about this book is it tells a really good story. And a complete story. And so we'll talk about each chapter. So in the introduction, Joel says, the twin crises of resource depletion and climate change are the feet of clay of our economic system. Sustained disruptions in economic production and distribution will eventually destabilize the system. And as we know from his history, this will precipitate a much larger sea change. The seemingly intractable problem of both of these situations is institutional. They're built on an assumption that the same business and government institutions that brought us to this point of resource exhaustion are somehow going to solve the problems. Large corporate and government institutions are just not equipped to deal with these problems, programmed as they are to build their empires and conquer and such. The central message of this book is this: if the problem is institutional, then institutional transformation has to be the solution. Joel, you want to comment on it?
So throughout my work, you know, I've been writing for 30 years, I guess, and from day one, even currently, my new project actually that I'm working on is called the New Triage Economy, and that's going to be coming out next year. Throughout all that work is a focus on social institutions or social institutions and economic institutions. And so you can imagine what it's like for me as an economist. First of all, you know, I go to a party, people say, "What do you do?" I say, "I'm an economist," and they go, "Oh," and they walk away. You know? And then, you know, somebody sticks around and they say, "What do you focus on?" And I say, "Institutions," and their eyes kind of glaze over, and that's the end of it. So what I've realized in my work is that at the very core of every economic system, going all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome, right up until now, are institutions. How we socially organize the social structures and the rules and norms and regulations and laws and all those things, how we structure that defines what we do as people. And yesterday in my talk, I talked about how there's that sort of cliche saying of, you know, madness is defined by people doing the same things over and over again, expecting different results. Well, doing the same kind of economics over and over again, expecting it to be sustainable or socially just or, you know, whatever problem that we're facing, it's a kind of madness. And so what I've been trying to do, and I've written a lot about Buddhist economics as well, is for us to sort of pull our brains and our minds and our habits of thought out of these traditional ruts and try to, you know, be open and explore other ways of doing things. And that means recreating social institutions, economic institutions. And, you know, just one last thought. All right, so I was talking to someone in Portland, the Portland Transition place, and she came up to me and she said, "You talk all the time about institutions. What does that mean? You think we should start a bank?" And I said, "Yes, yeah, yes. Create a bank. Start a bank right here in Portland, right here in Rochester. Build a bank. Yes."
Thanks, Joel. So we'll move on to Chapter 1. The title of Chapter 1 is From Transition to Transformation. Joel tells the story of the transition movement with some background of the movement and its philosophical underpinnings. It's the main goal of transitions is to foster community-based projects called transition initiatives. Most of the ingredients of the model are directed toward creating wisdom, raising awareness, organizing, training, reskilling, democratic participation, and planning. And effectively dealing with the problems of global warming and peak oil will require more than a transition. It will require a transformation. Joel?
Right, so just briefly, transition sort of implies moving from one form to another. Transformation means, in my view, creating an entirely new form, right? So a complete change in all of our institutions. Like I said, you know, financial particularly, I think, is most important in an economic world. and then all the way down to our habits of thought and how we see and experience the world internally.
Okay, thanks. Chapter 2, Economies in Transition, a Systems View. Joel fleshes out a broader understanding of economics by taking a systems or holistic view. A genuine understanding of economic transformation requires a broader systems view of the interconnectedness of people, economic institutions, and their habits. He encourages citizens to become active agents for change by transforming themselves inwardly and transforming their communities outwardly.
So that was kind of a key part of the talk yesterday about transforming communities in the context of the crises that are coming down the pipe with climate change. And so, when we start talking about limitation of resources and damage to infrastructure because of hurricanes or tornadoes or floods or wildfires, this is not only going to compel communities to change and rebuild, but it's becoming an imperative. And so my thinking here in this book and the other work that I do is, if we're going to be forced to change everything from top down, let's do it in a spirit of celebration and creativity and thoughtfulness, and it doesn't have to be miserable, I guess, is what I want to say. Yeah.
Great. Okay, the chapter 3, This Road Paved with Good Intentions. A cautionary tale about our attitudes toward economic growth, money, and our expectations regarding trying to live in a truly sustainable way. It has become deeply ingrained in American culture where there is a widespread expectation that financial investments will keep growing forever. For this to happen, the production and consumption of goods must grow forever as well. But it cannot, because the carrying capacity of the planet won't allow it. To move toward ecological permanence would require a real change, not half measures, a much deeper transformation, and a clean break from business as usual.
What can I say on that? So I was talking to someone about this not too long ago, about the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and I actually decided to flip that and say the road to good intentions is paved with hell. And it's just the idea that when we set out to radically transform our economy by rebuilding and building new institutions, well, that's going to be a lot of really, really hard work, politically, academically, on the ground. It's just, it's such an enormous task that I think it's, a turnoff to a lot of people. They just, what's on TV? I don't want to think about this. But the problem, though, is that we're not going to have a choice. Eventually, this is going to come to pass, that we have to start doing these things and making these changes. And so, in this work, I'm always trying to say, well, let's be proactive. Let's get out in front of this. Let's be smart about this. Let's create these institutions that we need now, rather than wait until we're, sort of beaten over the head. Yeah.
Thanks, Joel.
One quick question.
Go ahead.
triple bottom line, and maybe and are a little bit critical about the triple bottom line, and it's something that, like, having a foot in the corporate world and the sustainability world, we talk a lot about the triple bottom line, or even the quadruple bottom line. So I'm just curious, like, how to kind of push the conversation further beyond, you know, the triple bottom line. Because I feel like we keep having these spiral conversations that maybe necessarily aren't super impactful.
Now, you're talking about you and your colleagues having spiral conversations that, like, there's what are you saying, like a certain, like, disingenuous feeling in the conversation?
Maybe
or
a little bit. Like, how do we really push change in a meaningful manner when we're kind of stuck in the traditional capitalist mentality? Like, sometimes I feel like the triple bottom line is just a, you know, kind of like icing.
To kind of build on that, I was going to ask, do you think as a society we've had kind of like a shock treatment these past 3 years to,
with COVID?
yeah, in regards to our embracing capitalism and likes that we've realized we can do with a lot less. Yeah, we can live our lives differently. We enjoy society. There's material things that we suddenly realized we could get by with what we had. You know, supply chain issues are an issue, but, you know, you start to reuse things.
Were you at the talk yesterday, by chance?
I was up at the
'cause-
solar thing.
But that's exactly what I was talking about yesterday. I mean, I opened the talk with COVID and how exactly COVID opened this whole issue about the vulnerabilities in the supply chain, and but also the possibilities, as you say. You know, if we start to see the vulnerabilities in the supply chain are actually everywhere, and they're going to become increasingly problematic in the future. So that now sort of zeroes our focus back to the community. And what I was talking about yesterday is trying to pull tight our economic resilience into the community so that when this happens again, and it will, that we'll be better prepared for it. Now, back to Amanda's question about the triple bottom line dialogue. I'm trying to think of something that's not flippant, like let's learn martial arts, But I think who was it? Dick Roy. He said it's like a three-legged stool, right? And there's sustainability, there's society, and then there's the economy, right? And it's that economy, that financial side, is this really, really long leg of the stool that makes it unbalanced. And there's really no way to convince the corporate mentality that has to be diminished in order to create some kind of balance with the other things, because that's not the way corporations have been chartered to function, right? And you could go back to, I think it was 1919, that General Motors case where the shareholders sued the company because they weren't actually doing their fiduciary responsibility of maximizing shareholder equity. So when we see corporations as a beast, and that beast, it was created to maximize shareholder equity, and that's all it does, and it does very, very well. It functions like a very efficient carnivore, right? And so to try to get that very efficient carnivore to become a vegetarian is impossible. So the idea then is to create different institutions, right? So in that dialogue, I guess, it would be, you have to decide, these people have to decide, Is it the shareholders that are the primary constituents in this work, or is it the community and the citizens of our, of Rochester? And they have to answer that question, right?
That's great. So chapter 4, E.F. Schumacher and the meta-economists, he revisits the work of visionaries who, for over a century and for various reasons, have been making appeals to for the very same kind of economic and cultural transformation. They are meta-economists because they are seeing economics as something that should serve higher moral and ethical values that transcend the specifics of economic activity. And this chapter concludes with an overview of E.F. Schumacher's work on economics and philosophy, where Schumacher argued that economic activity should be guided by wisdom rather than greed, and carried out with the aim of ecological permanence rather than exploitation.
Oh, so, yeah, how much time do we have? Because I really like talking about these guys. But, so, the work that I'm doing now, I'm on my 6th book. I'm in dialogue with my publisher on the 7th book, and it's all about these visionaries, particularly American visionaries in the turn of the 20th century. And I do, in this book, I write about John Ruskin and William Morris. I don't know if you guys are familiar with those guys, but they spearheaded the arts and crafts movement in the United States. And what it was a movement to bring artisanship, to this sublime level that was not only about the perfection of their craft in terms of making mushroom lamps or, architecture or whatever, but it was also very spiritual. Like it was coming from a place that was guided by an energy that went beyond just their skill set. And the Americans that I write about in this book were the early 20th century cultural critics who saw the violence and the exploitation and the greed and just like this dominant structure of power that was building, with Standard Oil Company and all this at the time. So most of these people, their work was dismissed and mocked. One of them was, I'm actually curious. Has anybody in this room, aside from, if you read the book, heard of Ebenezer Howard by chance? So Ebenezer Howard was the guy who invented urban green space. That his ideas of building livable communities and industrial systems and green spaces within a city then became the model for the Epcot Center in Florida. And he was, at the time, he was mocked, he was ridiculed, people made fun of him. But I think it was in 2005, there was a conference where they were celebrating urban design systems, and they said, we all owe homage to Ebenezer Howard. So these are people who, in their lifetimes were sneered and mocked, but then later their work was elevated. So one of my students some years ago said, your work is going to get famous. The problem is that it's going to be like 30 years after you're dead.
Thanks, Joel. So chapter 5, the new monastics, is specifically about building new institutions. And so these are examples of things that are working well and where they tried new things. And one thing that's in here is city planners in Oregon have for decades been redesigning the Portland metropolitan area specifically to reduce dependence on fossil fuels, and in the process have created a mecca for bicycling and transit enthusiasts from around the world. And examples of work, these examples that he gave are examples of work consistent with the values of livability, social and ecological stability, and equitability.
The new monastics, right?
Yep.
So the title of that chapter, The New Monastics, is borrowed from a friend of mine, Morris Berman, and he wrote a book called The Twilight of American Culture, and we first met at a conference in Milwaukee, and I gave a talk about the 2008 crisis, the financial crisis, and all that stuff. And afterward, he came up to me and he said, "Oh, you are a new monastic." And at the time, I didn't know what he meant. And so I went back and got his book and read. And what he was saying is that as the system starts to become unstable and the institutions start to become problematic and everything starts to look like it's going to unwind, there's always going to be people who are going to start gathering up the things that are of value right here and right now. We're going to collect things. We're going to find the technology and, the art forms, the language, all the things that we need to move forward. So he saw that historically as when the Roman Empire collapsed, the monastics, Dominicans particularly, they started assembling, and gathering up all the bits and pieces of the Greco-Roman culture that would be of value, and they carried it with them into Western Europe to create a new civilization. So the idea of a new monastic is to find the things that are really, really good. What we're doing now, look around. What are the business models or the technologies or the, whatever it is, and let's preserve those. Let's make sure that we keep those with us as we move in a different direction. I'm not sure exactly I would put Portland, Oregon. That was like 10 years ago. Portland's changed a lot since then. But what I can say about Portland, though, is it has been sort of a model city in some ways in terms of urban planning, urban design. What the city of Portland did many years ago is they set out the 2040 plan. It was like, by 2040, what they want to have is all of the suburban areas connected to the metropole by mass transit. And all the satellite communities have access to all the amenities, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, food, everything that you need so that you don't have to drive or take, the bus or whatever to one place or another. And I think they've been fairly successful at doing that, but the problem with Portland over the last several years is it's just been flooded with an influx of population. People have moved there in massive, massive numbers. It just dwarfed the city. And now Portland has all of the same kind of problems as Seattle, San Francisco, LA, San Diego, overpopulation, massive homelessness, crime problems, and just So, yeah, I'm still kind of, sort of chafed, rubbed the rough edges of Portland too much. But anyway, I think that it still stands, as a place where a lot of other places, cities can learn from what Portland has done, not so much about where it is right now.
I'd ask a question. So I agree with what you're saying, and like Portland did accomplish all of these things that are still, especially in urban planning, referenced.
State of the art.
Yeah, but then you look at the past few years, and you look at when we talk about kind of the resilience for like, but what if XYZ thing happens? I mean, influx of population. Minnesota, we're going to be having that, right? As the coasts hollow out and the south gets kind of less hospitable, and you look at like Portland right now. I mean, everyone will reference that as one of the best bike cities in the country. Well, they're really stepping back away from kind of continuing to be a leader in those areas, and the numbers of people who do bike lead in that city are decreasing. And you look at kind of the economic segregation as really it's rampant. I think it makes top 10 now.
Is unaffordable.
It's unaffordable, but it's historically unaffordable.
Yeah.
And like this was a city that, again, we're referencing as like, look at all this stuff that they were setting up well back in 2010 to 2014. It didn't hold up in the way that it needed to, and that's where we're at presently. So how does a place like Minnesota, where I think there's a lot of people, especially you look at like Duluth, are hedging on that being this climate refuge, how do they kind of, who should they be looking to for lessons if it's not a place like Portland, given that Portland has not been successful?
Yeah, so you're exactly right, and I think that this is going to be an issue that every city has to deal with. People are going to naturally start to migrate to places where there's water, and Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen, he said that if you look around the world, there's always movements of population of people going to places where there's water. And when they get there, there's trouble because there's already people living there, right? Those are already densely populated area because there's water there. And for that reason, there's conflict. And political leaders tend to deal with conflict after the fact, right? I mean, they never try to, sort of say, okay, I can see this conflict coming, let's do something. It's always retroactively, right? So I think that all of these cities need to start looking at what's going to happen to Duluth or Rochester or whatever in 10 years from now when there's like 50,000 people trying to move into the city from places where there's no water. And, I wish that I had a solution, leave it to the public planner, the public administrators to come up with that. But
Separate of the water issue, which is huge, you said early on that solutions need to come from the community level.
right,
And I think what we're touching on is that communities are much more fluid than they ever were. Rochester used to be a company town, Mayo Clinic and IBM. And I think people came here and you joined one of the companies and cradle to grave and beyond because you had defined benefit packages and the likes. Now, I think the statistic of people staying in town is, I can't quote the number, but it's incredibly, like every 5 to 7 years, or 2 or 3 years.
Homes are owned for 5 years on average.
Yeah. So how do you incorporate these community-based changes when there's such a turnover of population?
right.
It's not just people coming in; it's people coming in and leaving. They have no vested interest.
It's like a continuity of efforts towards these goals.
That's right. And And also the cost of housing, you know, housing affordability then becomes a central problem, which is, yeah, you know, it's like Portland is extremely unaffordable now. Yeah. So that's just like an ongoing dialogue that everybody has to have at the community level, because each community is going to have its different set of problems.
Well, it's kind of the argument, the old institution was company towns. They were very stable. I don't like company towns.
And we should like wrap up the book, and then we can have Q&A further. Well, let's do that. So we'll come back to that, okay? So yes, so the next one is the final chapter is chapter 6, Education and the Great Transformation. This is what EarthFest is about. This is what the Right School is about. So it's why I loved it. So transforming our economic systems into something new and better will require the development of educational programs aligned with this effort. Moving toward a livable future will require that people develop new skills and technologies, create new cultures, foster creativity, and raise awareness. Educational institutions need to develop new curricula and workshops that will provide tools and guidelines for people who seek to learn how to become citizens in their communities and to design, heal, manufacture, grow, repair, rebuild, as well as to become the visionaries of their own generation.
So yeah, I don't really have much to add. I mean, that pretty much summarizes it, other, you know, than, you know, this is consistent with all the other things I've been writing about with institutional development. We have to create and build institutions that are, they have a specific purpose that is to educate and reskill our local community, not just kids, but everybody. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, Joel. Let's just give him a round, just go Joel a round of applause. So I'm gonna leave Joel on his own up here and turn over the Q&A for Joel.
So, yeah, go ahead.
All right, let's start with the last
It's,
name. Sadie.
Staley?
Sadie. I like Staley though, I'll take it.
Sadie, yeah.
So last thing you were just talking about is institutions and re-educating. Re-educating, you know, this has come about a number of different times, especially as things like automation take over and particularly things like coal mining. The people, though, that need that re-educating, it's offensive for the rest of the world to say, oh, sorry about your job, you need to be re-educated, even though we all know that's ultimately what's best for people. So instead of saying your job can be done better by something else and you should be re-educated, how can we instead give people agency in that kind of decision and let them be their own decision? How does that even come? I mean, I understand there's a whole lot behind that in order to help people come to that, but
Like democratizing the process is,
me personally, I'm starting to think democracy is going to become a word like communism.
Oh.
Like, communism, in theory, phenomenal, awesome, perfect. In practice, not. So is there a different word that you mean that you're using democracy to?
well, like, I'm just trying to understand your question. So if I get what you're saying is like we have coming down the pipe, you know, what's coming to us is a structural change imperative. And part of that structural change imperative is going to be to reskill the population to be able to do a lot of the things that they, right now, maybe many of us don't know how to do. And and put an emphasis on the fact that we have to do it if we want to become a self-reliant community in the future. So the structural change imperative then comes to an objective of becoming a self-reliant community, right? So we asked the community, how are we going to reskill everybody or up the skills so that we can actually start to do that? I think that it's an organic process. It doesn't have to be political or even institutional in that sense. It's something that when people start to see that there's a need to do these things and fix these things or make these things, they're going to start doing them. Rebecca Solnit, she wrote a book some years ago called A Paradise Built in Hell. And it was about 2001, 9/11. And what she talked about there was that outpouring of compassion and, just this willingness to get out there and do stuff and fix things from people in New York. So what she was saying in the book is, how can we tap into that compassion before the disaster hits or outside of some sort of cataclysmic scenario?
So perhaps instead what you're saying that I took in a wrong way is that we all need to be lifelong learners. We all need to be taking more community ed classes.
We all do. We all do. Yes. All of us. Me too. Yeah. And that's part, when Ivan first invited me to come here, I jumped at the chance because it was going to be in person after 2 or 3 years of COVID and Zoom stuff. The idea of being able to come and talk with people face to face, I always learn stuff. I always get inspiration, so this stuff is really, really good for me, Yeah, go ahead. You had your hand up.
One of the things in terms of the re-education, it isn't always to learn more technology and to go up, what we think of as up. But I'm thinking of, I'm 76. Both my grandparents came off of farms. One ran a dairy, both of them milked cows. I know how to milk cows. I know how you grab stuff out of the garden and eat it when it's fresh and what a difference that makes. But my boys, in spite of that and trying to pass that on to them, their grandparents lived in the cities and they worked in offices. And so they haven't had that. And so then those right classes and whatnot become very important for them. Because we are going to need to have people trained to do the things that make you self-sustained. Whether it's running a local dairy, whether it is growing local crops. You look at the number of restaurants, including this one, that raise their own vegetables and whatnot, trying to make it local, a local circle. And there are, and I know how important that is, and yet I haven't necessarily passed it on to my 40-something children that are going to need to know those things. And so some of the re-education has to be in an entirely different way. It's having, how do you set up a garden? What do you do to get the soil ready? What do you do to, it's a whole different technology than learning how to run a computer.
Right.
Because there isn't that many people that can get a job there.
Well, and also there's a living laboratory on the planet right now about being forced to learn how to do things, and that's in Ukraine, and they're being smashed violently, and their infrastructure is being destroyed, their crops are being stolen. There's just all kinds of atrocities being committed in that country, and these people are amazingly resilient, amazingly creative in how they're adapting and sort of rebuilding everything, across that country. So I'm watching this very closely because I think that there's a lot we can learn from the Ukrainian people in that regard.
Well,
Ivan?
There's just so many skills.
Yeah.
And I want to tag on to that with, we kind of glossed over in the introduction where you talked about resource depletion, peak oil, and climate change, of course. And all of those are going to be putting a restriction on our consumption
Right.
necessarily. So there will be an energy descent coming. And with that, that is what's getting to a sustainable level. Permanence is what you refer to it as. We aren't going to have the high energy society that we do right now. So that's where these skills come in that you're talking about. Why we need to relearn all of these things and change the way that we're doing things.
Right.
Is there not a fundamental tension when someone mentioned coal miners? If eventually that's going to be phased out, is it going to be the institution that says we aren't going to be needing this skill that you do? Here are some options. You can learn to do these other things, or maybe you just get retirement pension benefits or something. And they're not the ones that are wanting to learn this new stuff for the most part. They're happy. They want to work here. Maybe a generational job. They're proud of what they do.
The sad part of, and I think, at least I tried to get this message across yesterday. I'm not sure I did, but what I was trying to say yesterday is that the opportunity to really begin making those fundamental changes was about 30 or 40 years ago. And had we begun the process of transitioning away from fossil fuels back then, we could have much more seamlessly, I think, started pulling people out of that coal mining industry and gradually, assimilating them into something else. But shock therapy is never a good plan. I mean, it's like, okay, we're shutting down the mine, devil get the hindmost, right? That's a recipe for horror, disaster, and violence. And I blame administrative government short-sightedness on this.
My concern is that right now we have a very large segment of our society that their financial poverty keeps them from doing any of the things that we need. And we have kids in schools that don't have meals at home, and so they have all-day funding meals. It's all about that. We have food deserts in cities. We have places where people don't know how to make their own food, even if they got it canned in the store, and they eat on a quick trip. And how I think for people most of the people here, we're economically able to think about it, but I don't think that we're giving enough attention to the huge investment we're going to have to make in people in true poverty. And I think that eventually, like you said about Ukraine, this is going to be Ukraine all over the world.
That's right.
Not just in one country. And right now, Ukraine is hanging on because of all the assistance from other countries.
That's right. That's right. And we see the migration, the northward migration from Central and South American countries. It's in direct response to climate change damage. I mean, they would prefer, most of those people would prefer to just stay in their homes and, the places where they grew up, but they can't because they can't grow food or crops or coffee or whatever it is, cash crops there. Yeah, I wanted to say Dwayne, but that's not right. Drew, yeah.
So in all of these scenarios, we're looking at creating, if we're not forcing the change by some event or whatever, we're looking at martyrs within the economic system, right? Whether they're companies, whether they're people, all right, so I'm going to sacrifice my income because of what I believe. What is not the solution behind that, but what are if you believe that it's going to be a forced change, that's what it's going to end up coming to? Because personally, I have a hard time seeing a large majority of the population becoming martyrs for a cause.
At least in our country.
Forced change, yes. I agree. I don't see people suddenly changing their mindset because they read my book, But the other thing about that is it's a process. It's like the development of a pathology and our response to that pathology. And both of those things are some things that happen over time. So the pathology develops and our response to it evolves accordingly. So yes, it is a forced change, but it doesn't have to be like one day we get up and there's this big chasm in the earth and out comes, this boiling dragon that's going to consume all of us. It's not like that, right? I mean, we see piecemeal every time, these things keep recurring, we start to develop new ways to adapt. And yesterday in my talk, I talked about maladapting, the maladaptive nature of economics as it is right now, that our institutions and ideologies cannot adapt to the changes that are already here and are becoming more exigent every day. And so, again, let's be adaptive, creative, let's respond. Go ahead.
From an economic standpoint, economic history, we're looking for a way to introduce a new kind of economics, let's say. And for lack of a better term, I've used the word in my own head, steady state economics. I know nothing about economics. So if we're looking for a new one that isn't based on continuous growth, which is the lie we've been feeding ourselves since the Industrial Revolution, let's say, are there any models historically, overlooked economists' work or whatever, Ernest Kallenbach or Small is Beautiful, what's his name, that we can look to as models to help us develop this new kind of economics?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I fleshed some of that out in this book. E.F. Schumacher, of course, but I could give you a list. The one that tops my list always is Thorstein Veblen, and he, let me just say, Thorstein Veblen was part of a movement in the early 20th century that I call the original Chicago School. Because if you know something about economics, you hear the Chicago School, you think of Milton Friedman, free market, neoliberalism, all that kind of stuff. But these were the guys that were at the University of Chicago when the University of Chicago first opened in 1898. And these people were brilliant. They created a social and humanistic philosophy par excellence. And, so there was Thorstein Veblen, John Dewey, George Mead, Veblen's student, Wesley Mitchell, and his protege, Simon Kuznets, then went on to use math and science to develop a measuring system, a statistical modeling system that could track the well-being of the population. And that became known as gross domestic product. But the government kind of twisted it, over time, made it not so much about the well-being of the population, but about the well-being of corporations. But nonetheless, these were people that were building a paradigm that is all about the well-being of our population. And they challenged the Europeans. They were Americans, it was indigenous, and they were very creative, very brilliant. And it all started at Johns Hopkins University and then eventually went to University of Chicago. And then University of Chicago, because it was founded by John Rockefeller, Standard Oil, they smashed these guys and, they went to the margins. So, I'm always a champion of these economists that had really, really good ideas, but no one's ever heard of them.
How is your view down the road informed as you watch the efforts of institutions to try and reverse some of the inequities that have been foisted on the African American community and the growth of the younger people, younger Americans' awareness of what's going on and getting involved in the political movement? Does it give you hope? Please.
You know what gives me hope is what happened in Tennessee a few weeks ago. Those very, very young members of Congress in the Tennessee legislature were just pushed out nastily by the Republicans there. And they just went out onto the street and they were both of them black, and they were both named Justin, I believe. And so the chant on the street was, "No Justin, no peace. No Justin, no peace." Like, a play on the traditional no justice, no peace, right? And that really, really started this groundswell of political activism in Nashville, Tennessee. And they just put those guys right back in. And they're even more powerful. They managed to raise a ton of money off of this. And so they have an even more powerful voice than they did before the Republicans tried to push them out. So I like this. I think that kind of thing we're going to see more and more of it. And like I always say, these things are organic. They start to bubble up in certain circumstances, in specific communities where we need it. Yeah. I mean, I don't have some big blueprint for social justice. It'd be pretentious of me to say here it is, but I do have a lot of faith in that process. Ivan.
Joel, for education, for K through 12, can you speculate on kind of what maybe, what grade this should be kind of brought into this conversation and awareness, I guess, and what that might look like?
I that's kind of outside my,
Okay.
I'm an economist, I don't know, I don't have kids, I really don't know what age. Somebody else probably could answer that question better than I can, Start from the very beginning, I guess, that's the best I can say.
Okay, thanks.
one that was kind of jumping off an earlier statement that you made. One of the kind of maybe unfortunate realities of a lot of these kind of, especially the upper level economic institutions within academia, is that they do have that oil funding is such a huge component of it, and that kind of coupled with a lot of kind of other forces end up with kind of economics as a field really skewing a little bit kind of conservative on a lot of these topics. What do you see as being the pathway out of that? Given that I think there's a high likelihood that as we do kind of approach that peak oil, glut oil, it's the stream is loudest and the last dying breath kind of idea of they will be funding more and more and more up until they truly kind of reach that decline.
The economists reach a decline, you're saying?
That oil funding of economic academia.
Yeah. So, yeah, that.
Anything that'll lose your funding. I'm joking.
No, I lost my funding a long time ago. No, it's
Oil companies are way ahead of us. They're already going into renewables. Correct. They're trying to get a monopoly on
solar, whatever. Yeah, ExxonMobil. I mean, they've been trying to do this since 1980s.
So that's the institutional model that you talk about. It just grows and grows and grows for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. So I don't get invited to a lot of economist parties because when my first book I opened with a story about how George Washington died, and he was old and he probably had pneumonia or something like that, but that's not how he died. How he actually died was that he was bled to death by his physician. That bloodletting was at that time considered a legitimate practice, and so I compared the discipline of economics to bloodletting, and so immediately he got in a lot of trouble. But these guys get a lot of corporate funding, and this has been going on since the 1940s. It's a fascinating story about the Mount Palaran Society and how they rose to power. They got all this corporate money. They got all these people that started winning Nobel Prizes. They took over academic posts in all the major universities. So it was a real movement in the 1940s. And in fact, it was a movement against the very people that I write about, the institutionalists like Thorstein Veblen, Wesley Mitchell, and all these guys that were trying to do things for the population. But I think that a lot of that changed after 2008, particularly when Alan Greenspan made a public statement about how he came to see that his neoliberal policies that he's been pushing for 30 years were wrong. And so that admission, everybody was like, oh, okay, so now we have to start shifting gears, and from that point forward there's been just a flurry of really good work that's coming out, but it's just not at the University of Chicago or Harvard or those places. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm gonna throw out a name and just see what it triggers for you.
Uh-oh.
I don't want to prompt anything. Eleanor Ostrom.
Yeah. Okay. So Eleanor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize in 2009, something like that. 15, 12. She died a couple years ago, but she's what we call the new institutional economics. So it's not the traditional institutional economics like of Veblen and Dewey and the people that I talk about, but it's more about applying institutional analysis to traditional kind of game theory stuff, like behavioral economics. She's brilliant, obviously. She did some amazing stuff, but my criticism is from the foundational assumptions of the work that they do. And the new institutional economics paradigm is based on what we call the rational economic man, which is that we are hardwired to rationally maximize consumption and minimize labor. It's kind of like this utilitarian model where we want to go out and get as much pleasure from consumption as we can and do it with the absolute minimum amount of labor, right? So that basic assumption, that rational economic man assumption, lies at the foundation of that new institutional model. And Eleanor Ostrom sort of built some fabulous theories on top of all that. But I quote some of her stuff, here and there, as she, one of the things I really like about her is that she gave a really, really good definition of what we mean by institutions. And right there, is something that has always been kind of difficult for institutional economics because we have a hard time defining what it is that we're talking about. At the beginning of this conversation, I said, I'm an economist, and when I talk about institutions, everybody sort of, leaves the room. And part of that is because it's a very, very difficult thing to define. But she did. She did some good work in that. But I'm curious as to why you asked the question.
For two reasons. So I come from the school that she taught at. And within our school, what we talk about most, like the legacy, is in small communities governing themselves, which really struck me.
The commons, yeah.
When you were talking about, how instead of having larger rules for everybody, because these rules don't work for every state, we bring it up, right? Instead, having like your smaller community being more self-sufficient within itself, right? So within your small community, you can have somebody who knows about soil and can grow things. People in your community that can and things like that. And her work, I guess what was really brought to us in a number of different courses was the thought of let small communities govern themselves because they will hold themselves accountable. We don't need some huge, whatever, ominous thing or person doing it because we don't like them. We don't know who they are. We don't care, right? But when you know your neighbor, you're less likely to harm your neighbor, right? So I guess that's why I bring it up. And the second is just in refuting the idea of the tragedy of the commons, in that the tragedy of the commons is only possible when you have private entities
That's right.
involved. It's not a public problem, it's a privatized problem.
I forgot to mention that. When you brought that up, then I thought, because she wrote a lot about that. The idea of the commons and the tragedy of the commons and so on. But that's right. Yeah.
So Joel, I wonder, how are you doing? I think, we've been talking for quite a while. Should we call it and then people can still stick around if they want?
It's, up to the group. If there's people who still have some burning questions,
Okay.
I'm willing to answer or talk, but if not, we can call it a day.
If you're willing to keep talking, I want to check in, make sure you're doing
It's
it.
up to the gang.
I'll just keep sending beers out there.
I saw that, so I'm refueled. Let's go.
So let's take a minute, just give them a big hand for.
Thank you.